Today, developers spend a lot of time worrying about their code, how do they make it reliable. Anywhere between 40 to 60% of the developer's time is on all of the kind of scaffolding versus the core business logic.
Preeti Somal, Senior VP of Engineering at Temporal, discusses the challenges of building and operating large-scale, reliable systems, drawing from her experiences at Temporal, HashiCorp, and Yahoo.
Temporal recently just released this State of Developer report. What are the key highlights?
About 36% of the engineers and leaders that were surveyed kind of had reliability and compliance as their top need, even more than cost or performance. Our focus at Temporal is around making it easier for developers to build these reliable, mission-critical applications. The thing that is so magical is that the Temporal platform itself takes care of all of these reliability concerns. We shield the developer from all of the complexities of running and building reliable code, and the developer can focus on their business logic.
It sounds too good to be true.
Our two co-founders have been kind of working on this problem for a lot of years, so it's not an easy problem to solve. How we do that is essentially we've had customers tell us that they've been able to get like 6x developer productivity, but also peace of mind and knowing that reliability is taken care of. I wish we had Temporal back when I was at Yahoo. It would have really made my life so much easier back then.
Hello guys, welcome back to another new episode of the Tech Lead Journal podcast. Today I have with me SVP of Temporal, a company that I've been hearing a lot good things about Temporal in the recent months, right? Preeti Somal here with me today. I'm really looking forward to learning from you, from your career journey and about Temporal. And I know that Temporal just recently launched a State of Developer report as well. So yeah, looking forward for our chat today, Preeti.
Yeah, likewise. Thank you for having me on your podcast, Henry. And I'm really excited to talk more about myself and technology and Temporal.
Yeah. So maybe let's start from yourself first, right? I always love to invite my guests to share some career highlights or turning points, learnings that you have throughout your journey that you think we all can learn from you.
Yeah, that sounds great. I think for me, I started off my career in enterprise software. I started at Oracle, spent some time at VMware. I would say, though, that the turning points were sort of the three roles after. The first one, of course, was Yahoo. And Yahoo, for me, was the first time that I was on the other side, both building and operating tremendous web scale infrastructure for mission critical services. And so it was my first sort of opportunity to really learn about running services at scale, using open source, honestly. Yahoo, as you probably know, is a big user and contributor back to open source. And so that was fantastic learning. My customers at Yahoo were other engineering teams. So really the developers within Yahoo that used all of these platforms I was building. From there, my next turning point was HashiCorp. And I got to HashiCorp early in 2018 when the company was still 150 people. And really, I think it was an amazing journey. Again, open source developer, but also scale, how we scaled the organization, the teams, and continued to really remain close to the developer community. So I spent 5 years there. And when I left HashiCorp, this opportunity at Temporal came up, and we at HashiCorp were using Temporal. And so I was really familiar with the technology. And another turning point, because we run Temporal as a cloud service. And so mission critical scale reliability is like our number one value. And just learning to see how our customers rely on Temporal has really brought me a lot of perspective on the place we have in that technology stack.
Wow, I think we can see like quite an illustrious career so far, right? So I think, and also you joined at the right time, I would say, right? So maybe Yahoo back then was still kind of like big, right? And then moving to HashiCorp, we know where HashiCorp is now, right? And then lastly, joining new pretty exciting companies, right? I think it's going to be a big thing as well, Temporal. So yeah, maybe we can learn a little bit from these three companies in your career, right? So you are operating and running, a big infrastructure, maybe cloud engineering teams. What are some of the key learnings, seeing because you do not just handle a smaller scale kind of a traffic kind of infrastructure. So tell us a little bit more about this journey. What kind of scale you're running back then, and what are some of the key learnings?
Yeah, absolutely. So at Yahoo, the scale was literally running, the entire sort of internal cloud services. And I'll pick on one system, which was the monitoring service. And this monitoring service, and I'm talking about 2008 to 2013. So it's been a little bit of time, but it was called Yamas, and it was consuming billions of sort of time series data points on a daily basis. And in fact, in terms of the scale, it was getting to a point where we were really looking at perhaps taking this data and moving it to the Hadoop big data clusters as well. So that's a quick idea on scale. But I think from a learnings point of view, it's really around taking kind of scale reliability seriously, because these are mission critical systems and outages are very, very costly. And when I say seriously, I mean both in your design, build, how you iterate, how you test, what your incident response sort of culture is. All of these pieces ultimately result in a culture of like strong engineering ownership. And this was one of the things I really learned at Yahoo, that there was a tremendous amount of ownership and pride in like the work we did. Because you think about it, a lot of the infrastructure work is really invisible, right? Like Yahoo would launch a new consumer set of application, but nobody in infrastructure gets any visibility around that. And so you really need to have a culture where your engineers are deriving that satisfaction because of the scale and the reliability that they're able to hit.
Yeah, I was about to say that when you mentioned about invisible, right? Yes, pretty much when things are all right, but when things are not all right, like outages, I think
Yes.
pretty much infra team is the most visible. I had that experience as well back then in my previous company. And yeah, I think it's quite funny when you said that, right? So I think back then you kind of like building this internal engineering platform, I would say, right? Platform engineering is
Right.
quite famous term these days, and internal developer portals. So you were running it back then, long time ago. So any kind of learnings that you think are still pretty relevant to what we call platform engineering now?
Absolutely. And it's actually really interesting because platform engineering now is becoming like this big sort of pattern. But back 10, 12 years ago, like literally the team I was part of was called platforms, right? And so a lot of the learnings I think are very relevant, which is really around make sure that you are sort of working very closely with the consumers of your platform. Pick a few use cases, make your customers successful. Nowadays, we would call it like developer relations, or, having a product manager on board. Set some goals and targets around adoption. Make sure that you are providing visibility into how you're doing around kind of the objectives that you've set out for, and talk about them. Going back to the invisible sort of theme we were talking about, one thing we would do at Yahoo was we would put posters up in the kitchens about like the work that the platform team had done, and just create more visibility into the work that you're doing and the value you are providing as well.
Well, I think it's pretty interesting, right? The putting the posters for your internal platforms. I remember Google also has this something they call testing in the toilet kind of thing. So
Right.
I used to work at Google as well. So whenever we went to the toilet, you can see some posters about testing patterns or these, good design pattern for testability. So I think it's pretty similar thing. I guess like you should put visibility so that people kind of like unexpectedly learn about your platform. When you mentioned about reliability as a key thing, back then Yahoo has a lot of engineering teams, I suppose, globally, right? And a lot of internet skill as well. What kind of key things that you think is the most critical thing that people should know about reliability and how to kind of like do a good pattern to ensure that reliability is kind of high?
Yeah, great question. And I think reliability for me has been an area that I now spend a lot of time in, given my role at Temporal. I think I wish, first of all, that we had Temporal back when I was at Yahoo. It would have really made my life so much easier back then. But really, I think the pieces we would worry about a lot is the patterns that break. How do we make sure we have like fault tolerant systems? How do we make sure we've got all the alerting and monitoring in place so that we can respond and recover quickly? Thundering herd problems, making sure that we had all the right like rate limits in place so that we weren't overwhelming downstream systems. All of the patterns that have kind of come up around distributed systems and engineering. And just to segue to my current role at Temporal, the thing that is so magical about Temporal is that the Temporal platform itself takes care of all of these reliability concerns. And that's sort of why I was saying, this has followed me to my current role as well.
Yeah, I think it's pretty hard to run a high reliable systems, especially when you have a distributed systems, many components running all together, right? Just to piecemeal what is actually happening for serving one request, for example, I think it's also not easy.
Right.
And the nature of, high traffic as well makes it even more difficult. So maybe let's go back a little bit to HashiCorp experience, right? I don't know whether HashiCorp back then runs like a highly scalable system, right? From my point of view, it's mainly the open source products that they have, right? Starting with Terraform, Vault, and all that. But lately they have also cloud platform. So tell us, what was your main highlights when you work in HashiCorp? What kind of things that you think are your biggest achievement there?
Yeah, I think for me, the highlights really were around how strong the HashiCorp community open source presence was, especially when you talk about Terraform. Terraform has sort of become a verb. It's a standard and everybody knows Terraform. And so I think the power of like taking this concept of infrastructure provisioning and enabling it as code so that it can go in GitHub and all of these benefits of code that brings forward, right? And the role that the developer plays versus uh, you know prior to something like Terraform, you had to either go ask for permission or you had to speak to somebody in IT. And the interesting piece also is that the technology trend around cloud becoming more ubiquitous was also happening around the same time, right? So, to me, I think the highlight really is community, how we worked with them, how we got contributions, and just the sheer sort of scale of the standardization that's happened around the HashiCorp products as well.
Yeah. And how do you see the kind of like the infrastructure as code side, right? So you were running platform engineering back then. How did you automate some of these, server creations and all that? And how do you think tools like Terraform, like infrastructure as code, maybe these days is more declarative as well? Like, do you see some kind of things that you think will be great to have back then?
Oh, absolutely. I think, I think the parts around it was definitely great to have like the code part of it, but the elements of being able to reason about your infrastructure and to be able to have those feedback loops as things were working or not working, scale or not, I think those pieces are definitely advancing a lot more now than sort of in the early Terraform days. fun fact is we are also using Terraform here at Temporal, but the workflow orchestration around Terraform is being done by Temporal, the Temporal workflows and the Temporal platform as well. And we can do a lot more there in terms of being able to really see what's happening in the provisioning flows and where we're running into issues and how we resolve them.
Oh, it's pretty interesting. So using Terraform in your workflow as well. So I must assume it's more like a dynamic infra provisioning and all that. That is
Yes.
part of the temporal workflow. So you mentioned about incident response. I think for someone running infra engineering org, especially a big scale, right? Definitely you cannot run away from like outages, issues, incidents, and all that. So tell us a little bit, how do you build such ownership and, maybe a great incident response as part of your learnings in all these organizations?
Yeah. I think my number one principle there is you have to lead by example. And so, when an incident happens, I get paged as well. I am joining the incident rooms, and you really need to show up for your team and help them understand that, this is really important. You care, you are there supporting them. I may not be able to actually help with the details, but I am there, and that sets a pattern. So I'd say lead by example. Second would be really have strong processes in place and just reinforce those processes every time an incident happens. So for us, those processes are around, okay, what's the on-call chain? How quickly does that on-call get escalated? Where are the run books? We've put all our run books in GitHub as well so that, they're available to everybody and we can take sort of improvements and enhancements from anyone within engineering. So have a really, really strong sort of process in place. And then finally, it's around being able to measure, report, and build a strong culture around this. So one of the things, for instance, that we do at Temporal is every 2 weeks, we have a meeting that's open to the whole company where we pick some incidents, and the owner, the person who was kind of the incident lead, basically runs through the incident timeline, the root cause analysis, what worked well, what didn't, how we're improving, and just sort of making it really normal to talk about this in a way that is really looking at how we get better. So building that culture through not just engineering, but through the whole company around reliability is really important in having a strong incident response.
Yeah, so I must also highlight the RCA, the root cause analysis postmortem culture part, right?
Mhm.
Because if we don't normalize talking about it, making sure that, first we handle it well. So hopefully the incident got resolved, right? And then what key learnings from there, how we can iterate and have this feedback loop so that we can improve the process. And I think the most important thing is probably the so-called the psychological aspect and kind of like making sure people are not very, very disappointed about failures, right? So obviously we don't want to have failures, but the key thing is how can we learn and improve the processes from there. So maybe anything about psychological safety, especially infra team, right? They always get a lot of scrutiny by everyone when things are going wrong, and maybe people think, oh, you're not doing your job well. So tell us a little bit more on this side, like how do you ensure the infra engineers feel safe and they are okay whenever incidents happen?
Yeah, absolutely. It's really important, as you know. I can see that you've kind of been through this and you feel it. It's very important. The way that we approach building that sort of psychological safety is around really, striving towards a blameless culture, really focusing on, what was the information that the engineer had and how they made decisions, and was there a need to do better in the tooling, the information gathering, and also really around what is it that we learned from this incident. And then one thing that's really interesting that we've started doing is at the end of the quarter, we actually send out a survey to all of the on-call engineers, and it's an anonymous survey, but it really is a way for us to gauge kind of like not just how they feel about on call and their effectiveness and kind of their sort of quality of life with on call, but also the satisfaction that really comes from feeling empowered and feeling that they have that psychological safety as well. And that survey is been really well received in that, okay, we care about that on-call experience and we want to hear from people and we want to make it better for the engineers. So I think these are some of the things that we're doing. And of course, I feel like the more we talk about this, the more we can share and learn from others as well. So I'm always open to new ideas around how we can do better.
Yeah, I think the survey part is really important, right? Especially people may not talk, especially this part of the world, right? I'm in the Asian part. So some people actually don't like to talk about failures, their frustrations. So they think it's a part of the job. And I think anonymous surveys probably every leaders can do, right? Just, build that culture where people can submit their feelings, their feedback, their frustrations anonymously. And maybe, yeah, we can take actions around that.
Yeah.
So let's move on a little bit to another topic that we would like to discuss today. I know that Temporal recently just released this State of Developer report, right? Every time I'm seeing in the industry, there's always this new state of something report, right? It's very exciting. But this is, I think, the first time Temporal is doing it. So tell us a little bit more about this report and why are you guys publishing this report?
Yeah, absolutely. We're super excited to have it out. And essentially, our focus at Temporal is around making it easier for developers to build these reliable, mission critical applications. And we have a really strong community of developers that is growing. So, what we wanted to do with the survey was really sort of tap into the knowledge of these engineers and developers and really try and understand, especially with AI, what are some of the patterns and trends? How are they viewing the technology that they have? What are their challenges? What's important to them? And so that's was really kind of the impetus of getting the survey out. And we hope to do this regularly so we can kind of, hear back in a very data-driven approach and then publish and share those learnings as well.
Well, yeah, looking forward to learning from this report. So
Yeah.
you mentioned about building, maybe building and using AI kind of thing, right? So that's pretty trendy these days, right? So do you see, first of all, the usage of AI, the adoption rate is really high as part of your survey? And secondly, how many teams are actually building AI related, systems or solutions in their, engineering teams?
Yeah, great question. So it's interesting that the data is a little bimodal in the sense of it's showing that 94% of the reports they're using some kind of AI tools, whether it's like a Copilot kind tool or Chat GPT. There's some sort of usage of AI tooling in their workflows, but only about 39% said that they've got sort of build any sort of major AI projects themselves at scale. So the usage is definitely sort of increasing, but like the infrastructure or to use it more sort of natively in the work they're doing or the customer application they're delivering, that is still early.
Yeah, so I would say many people would have adopt, some kind of AI tools, especially the chat part. Obviously, it's quite
Right.
common, ubiquitous, right? So, what's your takeaway as a leader, right? So, do you use also AI often, and can we actually use AI reliably for infrastructure related stuff?
Oh, I wish. I think so. Within Temporal, we are certainly also doing a lot of work with some of the tooling. One really interesting thing is we are seeing a lot of developers, engineers, companies building AI tools on Temporal. And one of the biggest things that we are seeing is that reliability is really, really important for kind of AI and agents to really be adopted in any kind of a sort of widespread manner. It's really interesting because these problems around reliability with AI agents are all very, very similar patterns to the reliability of distributed systems applications. And so we're seeing a lot of customers really coming to Temporal for solving these reliability problems. Now, on the other hand, for your question, sort of, are we using any infrastructure AI tooling at the moment? No. We may build some ourselves for our own uses because we haven't seen anything coming out that we think really fits our needs. But we don't have anything in production that we use internally at the moment.
Right. So yeah, definitely very interesting to see this space. I'm sure there will be lots of new inventions coming. Troubleshooting, debugging, and all that, I think is still pretty much maybe the most use case that people use, right? Especially when you see kind of like peculiar error messages. Sometimes like we don't know what is going on with that product, right? So I think
Right.
having an AI can help us. So you mentioned about building, operating AI kind of like systems, right? Personally, I haven't done it myself, right? So what do you think are some complexities that involved in, building AI systems, maybe agentic systems as well, that, requires like good reliability?
Yeah. I think when you think about like at the core of it, what the agentic AI system is doing, it's really sort of looking at what is a sort of customer problem at hand that they want to solve, whether it's like booking a flight or pick any example, and then looking at kind of calling out to one of the models around what are the various options, what is the recommendation, and then calling to some tools around making the booking or the changes. We think of it as it's essentially like a multi-step process where each step can be error prone. It's very common, for instance, to call out to a model and get rate limited and not get your response back, right? So the each of these steps is something that you could run into issues. Some of these steps could be fairly long running, especially, one of the things that is coming up is like agents that are learning based on your usage pattern, or when you need a human to do some approvals in that workflow. And so the big sort of reliability issue here is that if any one of those steps crashes or returns errors, what do you do? Do you start all over again? And we know that some of these steps are really expensive as well. And so this is where, we kind of have been really fortunate to have a product that has been running in production at scale with Temporal, where the core of the problem that Temporal solves is how do you take like this multi-step process and you do all of the reliability, state management, recovery pieces within the Temporal platform versus every engineer having to worry about it.
Yeah, so I think agentic systems definitely requires a lot of multi-step. Sometimes even the steps are not well defined in the first place because the model will kind of like build, what
Right.
steps that it needs to, to do in order to solve the problem. And I can
Right.
see like the complexities, right? So there's a undeterministic thing happening as well, and plus you don't know the kind of failure, I don't know, patterns that might happen with all those steps. So I want to save the time to talk about temporal at the end. But what are the key highlights or key learnings that you think we can talk about from the report?
Yeah, I think one of the kind of key learnings from the report that actually mirrors a lot of our conversation is how important reliability is. And so, about 36% of the engineers and leaders that were surveyed kind of had reliability and compliance as their top needs, even more than, for instance, cost or performance. So that was one finding from the survey. The other finding is this is not going to be new to you and me, but it's around how engineers make tooling decisions versus the people who have the budget, how they make the tooling decisions, and that continues to remain misaligned. I think this is a age-old problem, but that kind of came up in the survey as well. And last but not least is, again, not a surprise, but it's around how failures represent like real business risk, right? And we all know that an outage is potentially like a existential sort of threat for a company. And so again, the survey validated that these failures come with like this business risk that is sometimes hard to kind of quantify, but it's a very, very real sort of feeling and effect of a failure.
Right. I must say that I'm pretty kind of like not surprised by this. Reliability is the key thing. Compliance, especially security, privacy, and all that is definitely top of mind. And that failures and maybe incidents result in like business kind of a risk, right? And especially if you are running like an AI agentic system, first of all, how do you know it's accurate? How do you know it's reliable and all that? So definitely those part is, I think it's unsurprising. Well, what still surprised me is the choice of developer tooling, like what you mentioned, the misalignment. I know that it happens throughout various different organizations, but what I can say is like typically, like if the developers choose the tooling right, it can help a lot in terms of choosing the best tool that can serve the purpose really really well. Maybe in terms of adoption rate as well, it will be much higher. So tell us why the decision makers or the executives still think they can choose the best tools on behalf of the engineering team. So tell us a little bit more about this problem, misalignment, how we
Yeah.
can solve this.
Yeah. So, first, isn't it great when the survey kind of validates how you're thinking about a problem, right? But second, on the misalignment, honestly, we're not sure. Like the survey didn't, besides highlighting the fact that there is misalignment, didn't give us insight into why. And I think, for instance, 100% agree with what you're saying. The key here is to empower the developers. Our suspicion is that some of this stems from all of the compliance pieces that organizations sometimes, a lot of times kind of have to follow, where some of the tools that developers want to get might not have the SOX compliance or the HIPAA or whatever other compliance pieces are in play for your company. Yeah, so I think one of the things that is very real in our industry is in order to really get broader adoption within these bigger, more regulated companies, how can some of the sort of new tooling fit into their compliance and security frameworks as well? So I suspect that some of that misalignment is coming from some of these requirements that the developer may not see, but the decision maker has to comply with.
Yeah, so compliance security definitely typically top of their concerns, and the
Right.
second one is probably cost, right? Because some of these developer tools may be deemed as expensive, even though sometimes it's really hard to quantify the value coming out from the cost, right? If it can save a lot of I don't know engineering hours, I think that tool is worth that much, right?
Yeah.
But definitely, yeah, these are some of the things I also experienced myself back then, right? One concern is always about like let's say the management always think, okay, this tool is not compliant, not secure, the cost is pretty high. But every time I see new technologies coming, obviously they don't put a lot of focus on this area first, because like if you think about open source, it's more about functionality first, features, developer experience first, maybe. So tell us how for engineers who build these solutions to have this mindset about compliance, security, and maybe cost as part of their design as well.
Yeah. It's an excellent observation. And I think, I feel strongly that you really need to be clear about what your monetization strategy is going to be. And if you are really looking at sort of an enterprise market, you have to have the security compliance pieces in mind. I think security is like these days, it is a no brainer, as in, you really need to be thinking security first, right? Compliance is something that you could argue, like a SOC 2 compliance, or these things can come as you mature. But your architecture, your design for the platform and the product you're building really needs to be very, very security aware and security first. And so, for instance, one example I'll give you is Temporal. It is an open source tool, but we actually don't see any of the customer's code or customer's data. That all runs in the customer's infrastructure. And so that sort of design decision was made very, very early on, but has really resulted in much faster adoption because it took a whole conversation off the table when it came to a using and buying decision. So, my advice basically would be you have to think about security from the ground up. You have to make sure you're not going through any what I'd call a one way door on compliance, but you don't necessarily need to have all of the compliance pieces lined up early on. And on cost, it's again really important to think about just how you're going to monetize. And, at the end of the day, we know all these tools are competing for some share of budget, and being very clear on the value your tool brings versus the cost, and how that lines up. And then, also working hard towards lowering costs for developers, right?
Yeah. So hopefully, everyone that is building, this kind of tooling, developer tools and all that can also learn from this thing, right? So personally, for compliance as well, I think it is useful if, let's say, you already know what are the controls that whatever compliance certifications that you are aiming for, right? Like what are kind of controls that are coming, think maybe how you can bridge the gap, right, in the future, right, rather than having to retrofit, which is always difficult, especially if you're
Yeah.
already running with customers and data and all that, right? So I think that is also a tip from me. Let's maybe dive deeper into Temporal itself, right? So sometimes every few years, we will hear about this new paradigm in the engineering world where it is kind of like new, novel, like the way for solving problems. So we can think of, I don't know, like cloud is one, infrastructure as code as one, right? Service mesh is probably another one. And I think Temporal is kind of like somewhere in this space as well. First of all, is there's a paradigm shift. So maybe let me ask you, like, what kind of paradigm shift that people need to have whenever they think about Temporal?
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. So you're absolutely right. Temporal is a paradigm shift. Essentially, the thing that is happening is today developers spend a lot of time worrying about their code, all of the error conditions, how do they make it reliable. And there are some studies, for instance, that would say, anywhere between 40 to 60% of the developer's time is on all of the kind of scaffolding versus the core business logic. And the paradigm shift with Temporal is that we take care of all of that for you. So basically, we shield the developer from all of the complexities of running and building reliable code. And the developer can focus on their business logic. Now, the way that we do this is that you code to our SDKs, and the temporal server, handles all of the task dispatching, retries, all of the state management, all these pieces that are often distributed over lots of systems and very hard to manage and like trace through. We do all of that for you. Sounds good, right?
Yes.
Doesn't it sound great?
Yeah. I think it sounds too good to be true because I don't know like how many developers have built this kind of workflow. I would say if you are doing some kind of workflow distributed systems, you definitely can relate to this problem, right? But if you're just building a CRUD monolith, probably it is less so. I'm quite curious when you mention about this kind of complexity, right? Because I actually want to borrow the model like service mesh. I think it's pretty good analogy as well. Because in the past we used to, you know, worry about networking. How do we call, other services out there, the retries and also the back off, exponential
Mhm.
back off and things like that. And we bake that in the code, right? But with things like service mesh, right? it is all transparent. You don't actually see it. And I
Right.
see the same thing with Temporal as well, right? When you create your business logic, your workflow, you just focus on the business logic and you don't actually see all these other concerns, right?
Right.
Be it the retries, be it the state management, and be it the dispatching of the tasks. So this is, I think, first of all, is the most important thing. How do you actually do that, right? How do you actually make sure that developers can really focus on just business logic?
Yeah. So you captured kind of the paradigm shift really, really well. How we do that is kind of first, I think I wanted to spend a minute on like the history of Temporal. So Temporal, our two co-founders have been kind of working on this problem for a lot of years. They got together at Uber and sort of built this open source project that then became Temporal. And a lot of their sort of lessons around running distributed systems at scale are what Temporal solves for. So the main point here is that they've been thinking about this problem for about 15, 20 years. So it's not an easy problem to solve. And it's definitely one where it has been production tested. Now, how we do that is essentially we introduce some abstractions around what we call a workflow, an activity, and a task. And in this abstraction, essentially, we create a programming model where the developer is just focusing on their business logic. They have some rules that they need to kind of abide with. So, for instance, anything that is error prone, they would put in an activity. And that these abstractions then let us do things like retries. And we save the state of kind of the execution of that workflow. So we know at any given point in time where that code is and what's like past and what's coming next. And so if something were to crash, we have a concept called replay where we can go in and run again. In this, I'm simplifying this down quite a bit, but there's a lot of power in the programming model. But this is kind of the core of the paradigm shift is there's a few abstractions that the developers need to learn, and then we take care of the rest. And very frequently, what we hear developers say is that, like, understanding that paradigm shift was a little bit of effort because their natural instinct is, oh, where is my, like, if error do X kind of block, right? But once they get it, then they say that they can't ever look back. It's just such an elegant model that then they are like temporal developers for life.
Yeah. So I remember back then, I whenever I dealt with this kind of new programming model, right? So I've dealt, for example, for example, Hadoop, right? Data flow, which is having also Apache Beam programming model and all
Right.
that. Definitely the first key difficulty is understanding the model itself. And it depends on how good documentation is, how intuitive the programming model is. There's always this hurdle, right? So maybe from your experience looking at your customers or maybe developer adoption of the open source version, do you think temporal programming model and SDK is something that is difficult to learn?
It's not difficult to learn, but it is difficult to unlearn the patterns from wherever you came from. And what I mean by that is what we see is that developers kind of go through like a journey where at some point they don't believe it. And then there is an aha. And then they're like, oh my God, is this for real? And then they'll try it. And once they really kind of understand it, then there is a tremendous amount of excitement. And we've had someone come up to me at a conference and say, I couldn't sleep that night. The moment I finally understood temporal, I was so excited, right? So the the programming model itself is actually really simple, really elegant. But what typically happens is the developers coming in who are new to temporal expect to kind of have to do all of this work around sort of reliability and unlearning those habits takes some time. one thing that we are trying to do and we've put a lot of focus on is really do more community education. We have a Slack channel where our community joins in and shares what they've built. We've got something called Community Exchange where developers can kind of share the code that they've built and like link to their GitHub repo, etc. So we're really working towards just showing more code and doing more sort of education around the model as well.
Right. That's very interesting insight that you mentioned, right? It's much more difficult to unlearn what we know, especially
Right.
for maybe more senior developers who have had battle scars of building such system, right? So maybe for people
Right.
who cannot relate, if I can imagine some of the problems that we typically have, whenever you have like a business workflow with states, for example, right? It could be very simple, 3 states, for example, start, doing, and stop, right? And if it involves like kind of like events and multiple distributed systems, it's always very difficult to build some kind of reliability between these transitions and calling different workflows from other things. We used to have like messaging system with DLQ, and then the DLQ you need to take care of it. How do you know that the messages is there and somebody is picking up? So all this seems to be magically handled by Temporal, right? So I think that's a very big thing. I haven't actually played with Temporal, but I can actually imagine like these things will definitely be something that is great for developers to work with because it removes away all these unnecessary complexities, the boilerplates, the things that we don't like to do, right? And
Yeah.
plus, when you mentioned about persisting the states and all that, I assume it's very easy to troubleshoot because
Yes.
if let's say you don't have this, you only rely on logs, and we know that reading logs is not fun, and it's always
Yes.
very difficult.
Yes,
So
absolutely. Yes.
yeah, yeah. So I think if people are sold to this kind of new programming model and paradigm, right? So what do you think are some of the first step that they can do to actually try Temporal?
Yeah. So a few things. One is definitely join our community. Second is sign up for Temporal Cloud. For sign up, we have like credits that we give to developers, and we have like a quick start guide that helps you get set up and run samples, etc. And I think the third thing would be there's a lot of talks that our customers, developers who have built on Temporal, have done at our conferences. So, just listen to like another developer talking about how they're using Temporal. And that really, I think, will help you get started because then you can start sort of envisioning how you could bring Temporal to the problems you have at hand. One of the other things that we didn't talk about, but we hear a lot is not just that development teams can go faster. So, for instance, we've had customers tell us that they've been able to get like 6x developer productivity because all of that boilerplate, like all of that is gone. But also this aspect of like peace of mind and knowing that, reliability is taken care of and, failures happen. We know that in any distributed system, failures will happen, but recovering from those failures, Temporal will handle that for you. So that element of like how much peace of mind this brings to the teams that are on call is also a really significant part of the value we believe Temporal brings.
Yeah, thanks for the plug, right? So definitely recovering from failures, again, it's not fun thing. And I think the term that you guys use is called durable execution, right? So
Right?
you just think I submit an execution, right? And we just think that it will happen sometime, like
Yes.
especially if the system, doesn't crash all the time, right? I assume if the system can recover, I think the execution will get guarantees that it will be executed, right?
Yes.
So
Yes.
maybe a little bit about this term. How do you come up with this concept, durable execution? Maybe if I don't explain it correctly.
Yeah, no, you explained it really well. And I think essentially what we were working towards is how do we describe the concept? Because in the early days of Temporal, the natural instinct for developers is to try and compare you with technology they know, right? So are you a message bus? No. Are you, like a a Visual Studio type thing. No, right? And so durable execution for us really sort of encapsulates the core value that once you've built your code using the temporal model, we will execute it for you. Like that durability guarantee is really, really very strong. In fact, Henry, there's a really fun blog and video on our website. What we did was we sent our mascot with a Raspberry Pi running a temporal workflow to space. And what you can see is the workflow is executing, and at some point it stops because the Pi loses connection. And then after a little bit of time, it starts again because the Pi has come back into orbit and has picked up connection again. So we do these fun things as well around helping to show very visually in a very like real way, like how seriously we take that durable execution guarantee.
Oh, I assume that's a very fun videos, right? Definitely, we'll put that in the show notes. When you mentioned that, I also remember when I studied temporal docs. So you can even imagine like a scheduled task that is sometime in years ahead. Let's say you have a contract multi-years and you have to schedule something that runs whenever, I don't know, they want to renew or something like that. You can also submit it reliably to temporal, and it will make sure that at that point in time it will execute. So I think again, like building a scheduling thing is not fun, right? Especially for developers, right? How do you ensure it's reliable? And you still think about like when it gets executed or not. So I think that's a pretty interesting thing.
Yeah.
Maybe one concern,
Mhm.
one concern that people have whenever they adopt this new programming model, especially when it comes with a set of infrastructure, is the locked in, right?
Mhm.
So especially when you are embedded into this programming model, which is probably not so much common these days. So for example, people talk about cloud locked in, right? Even though in cloud you have many different options these days and they're kind of like interchangeable, right? So tell us about these probably, I don't know, concerns that people have about lock-in. How do you ensure that their code can still be portable if, let's say, one day temporal is not the solution for them?
Yeah, it's a very real concern. And thank you for bringing it up. I think the way that we sort of really live by our values is around the open source commitment, right? So essentially, our guarantee to a developer who's building using the Temporal SDK is that they can run their code on the open source sort of server that they could be running in their own infrastructure, or they could bring it to cloud without any code changes. And so we kind of guarantee that sort of code compatibility between Temporal Cloud and open source. And so from a vendor lock in point of view, you are honestly kind of the programming model is sticky, right? So if you want to use a different programming model, you will have to go change your code. But you don't have to rely on Temporal, the company, because the server is available in open source. And, we have a very strong sort of commitment to code compatibility between cloud and the open source server.
Yeah, that sounds really great, right? Especially like in the past, I also have this experience with Apache Beam. I don't know how much you know about it. Like it's a programming model,
Mhm.
runs first class on Google Cloud Dataflow, right? The product for these data pipelines. But they also
Mhm.
encourage other, they call it runners back then, right? Other open source project like Spark and a few other Flink, for example, a few other things can also run the same code with the same programming model, and
Right.
it can still be run, right? So people don't have a fear of being locked in, and especially if there's an open source solution that people can use, right? So definitely it's something that is good that you uncover, right? I guess because people always have this concern about locked in. And what
Right.
I'm concerned most is for those people who have unlearned that, their previous habits, they got this aha moment. They kind of
Right.
like locked into that paradigm shift, right? So I think that is more concerning for me, especially for developers. We don't like to go back and do all these mundane tasks.
Yeah,
So maybe
absolutely.
as we as we go to the our almost wrapping up the conversation, is there anything else about temporal or about the developer report that you think you want to cover as well?
Yeah. I think mainly, I want to just reiterate our commitment is really to make developers' lives easier, to help them just focus on their business logic and not have to worry about all of this sort of really complex, messy sort of pieces we've been talking about. We're committed to open source. We are available under the MIT license. We have a really strong community that is growing quite a bit. One thing we didn't touch is that our focus on developers is so incredibly strong that we build our SDKs across multiple languages. So we have Python, TypeScript, Java, Go, really sort of .NET as well. Our focus is, the way we think about it is we want to meet the developers where they are. And we're truly driven by making their lives better and more productive. On the Temporal Cloud side, we are available in like multiple regions across the globe. So we have a number of regions in the Asia Pacific area as well. And our goal with Temporal Cloud is to run the temporal service so that you don't have to worry about the reliability of the temporal service itself, right? And so again, go check it out, become a part of the community. And the best way to learn is by just sort of looking at samples and listening to others. Because, Henry, you and I know I can stand here and I can talk about temporal, but having someone who's used it from outside the company is always a much stronger indicator of the strength of the platform, right?
Right. And also, you just whenever you when you explain that, you just remind me about the compliance piece that you mentioned earlier as well, right? How do you ensure Temporal, especially the cloud part, is compliant and secure? And I can see actually banks are starting to adopt Temporal, right? I know like it's always very difficult to have banks adopting Temporal cloud. So
Right.
tell us about this important piece of compliance and security aspect that people don't know about, right? It's always
Yeah.
unintuitive. Yeah.
Yeah. So I think the first piece to understand is that when you build your code using our SDKs, you're building what we call a worker, and the worker is running in your infrastructure. We don't see your code. What we are doing on the temporal cloud side is essentially dispatching the tasks and the retries. One way I like to talk about it is think about a puppet master who is sort of, directing all of the puppets, but we aren't running the puppets in our environment that's in yours, and we are sort of the brains that is orchestrating all of these pieces. So that immediately kind of overcomes a lot of the questions around, do we see your data, do we see your code, and the answer is no. And then the sort of task dispatching pieces obviously need connection. That would typically go over something like a private link. And then on the Temporal Cloud side, we're SOC 2 certified. We have had some requirements from customers around having kind of their disaster recovery and primary region in the same country. We can sort of build a region wherever the cloud providers exist. So that's been pretty easy for us. And I think this is the kind of the elegance of the model around security that has really enabled us to move much faster and make inroads in banks using temporal cloud pretty quickly as well.
Yeah, pretty exciting. So I think if people hear about this conversation, maybe they think it's too good to be true. But I would invite people to just learn from the links, the community that Preeti has mentioned, right? Because I'm sure this requires a much dive deep kind of like discussions, maybe a study, right? Before you actually understand what temporal is. So Preeti, I think it's a pretty exciting talk, right? Unfortunately, we have to wrap up the call pretty soon. But before I let you go, I would like to ask you one question. This is like a tradition in my podcast. I call this the three technical leadership wisdom. You can think of it just like advice you want to give to us. Maybe if you can share your version today, that will be great.
Absolutely. I'd love to. And you said 3, right, Henry? Yeah. Okay.
That's correct. Yeah.
Okay. So I think my first one would be, really being clear about the problem you're trying to solve and think deeply and from a first principles viewpoint. You're really sort of solving the problem in a way that's very impactful and really hold that high bar around the problem and how you solve it. I think that would be one. I think the second piece of wisdom would be don't shy away from hard things. Sometimes it's easy to take shortcuts, but, you know, we're in this for the long term, solve the hard problems, and really don't sort of lose track of that long term piece that you're building. And then I think the third thing, and I know you said technical, but I think this is very related, is the team that you have and the people you work with. They are critical in solving any technology problem. Your engineering team, the talent, is your biggest sort of asset. It's how you can solve these problems. So make sure that you're hiring well, you're taking care of your team and your engineers, and you're motivating them and helping them understand the big picture and empowering them to have an impact.
Yeah, I would say it's pretty relevant, right? The last one, right? So I think it's pretty beautiful, especially when these days when people think about, maybe replacing more people with the AI. But I think engineering team is still kind of like, requires a lot of people, a lot of innovation, creativity, and ownership from people as well, right? So,
Right.
so to get it right. So if people love this conversation, they would like to reach out to you, learn from you. Is there a place where they can find you online, Preeti?
Yeah. In our community Slack, I am in there. You can find me there. Also on LinkedIn and Twitter. So absolutely come find me. I'd love to hear from you.
Right. Okay. Thank you so much for the sharing today. I learned a lot of insights from you, from your career, from the developer report, and especially about Temporal as well. So thank you so much for sharing today, Preeti.
Thank you, Henry. And I hope that your listeners enjoy the discussion today.